Okay, well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bore da, croeso i'r cyfarfod plant a pobl ifanc. Welcome to the meeting for children and young people today on the 8th of September. Obviously, welcome people. I'd just like to go around to start with so that members of the committee may introduce themselves so that everybody, the public watching, is aware who's here. I'm Tudor Thomas. I'm a councillor in Abergavenny and I'm chair of the committee. Go then to Maureen Powell.
Hello, I'm County Councillor Maureen Powell, councillor for Castle Ward in Abergavenny and a member of this committee.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. Malcolm Lane.
Good morning, Councillor Malcolm Lane, councillor for the Mardy and member of this committee. Thank you.
Okay. Will.
Morning, everybody. Will McLean, Chief Officer, Children and Young People.
Thanks very much. And then Councillor Louise Brown.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Louise Brown and I'm the councillor for Shire Newton Ward and also a member of this committee. Thank you.
Thanks. And Councillor Jo Watkins.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Councillor Jo Watkins, Caldicot Castle Ward and a member of this committee.
Thanks. And then Sharon Randall-Smith.
Good morning, everyone. Sharon Randall-Smith, Head of Service, Children and Young People.
Thanks. Well, Martin. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Who, me?
Crocod, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning of that. I'm Martin Crocod. I'm the member for the Lansdowne Ward in Abergavenny.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Crocod. And then if you want to switch off, and then lastly, Hazel.
Hazel Eilert, the Council Scrutiny Manager.
Right. I think I've covered everybody. Okay, should we go now then to the main agenda, and agenda item 1 is apologies for absence. Do we have apologies for absence, please? I've received one from Councillor David Jones, councillor for Criconi. I think Councillor Laura Jones, who's my vice chair. Anybody else?
Maggie Harris, Chair.
Oh, thanks. Yes, thank you. Maggie Harris, who's from the MASC, the Monmouthshire Group 4 school governors. There are no others. Any declarations of interest? We'll probably take these as and when if they arise. But if you have a declaration of interest, then obviously please raise it during the meeting.
Yeah, Tudor.
Yes, Maureen Powell.
As a governor of King Henry VIII, because we'll be dealing with results, I'm a governor of King Henry VIII.
Okay.
So it's not prejudicial.
No. Anybody else with any declaration of interest? No. Agenda item 3, public open forum. I'm not aware of anybody wishing to address the group this morning. Okay, and now we go to agenda item 4 and be handing over now to the Senior Officer for Children and Young People, Mr. Will McLean, who's going to give us a fairly detailed verbal update regarding school examination performance for 2020, and as we all know, this was somewhat fraught with difficulty in so many respects. But I hand over now to Will McLean.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair, and morning, everybody. Yes, what an exceptional year for me to try and comment on this morning for you all. We were we knew back on the 20th of March, when schools closed their doors, and the decision followed swiftly that examinations wouldn't take place this summer, that this would be an exceptionally challenging summer in terms of how our students were graded and assessed at the end of 2 key stages of education. So the 2 key stages we're talking about are Key Stage 5, that's those children age 18 who are leaving, typically in Monmouthshire schools having completed A-levels and BTEC qualifications, but also, of course, the end of the children's statutory education at the end of Key Stage 4. I think the first thing I want to just talk about is the decisions that have been made across the EAS region, and hopefully all members will be aware that the EAS are our partners in school improvement. They're one of our key kind of links with our schools. They work very closely with our schools, but also they work as part of the national education picture in that middle tier. And we've been very clear, and members will recall last year, that the way that we use performance data has changed significantly. The days whereby we would seek to publish on results day, you know, how each school had done, what percentage pass rates at certain levels or grades, have largely left us now, and they've left us for good reason. That they led to behaviours that weren't positive. They led to behaviours that were that led to schools taking decisions about how they entered children for certain qualifications and the way that they taught children for certain qualifications. And so we're now in a different period of time whereby examination results are a key part of how we work with our schools, but they're used in a much more, I think, probably nuanced or sensitive way, in the sense that that we have those very clear discussions with our schools, but we don't do that in a kind of publication of league tables or kind of distribution of how people have done. So I think that's the first thing to say. And I remember when I presented last year's Key Stage 4 and 5 outcomes to committee, we used anonymised data at that point in time, and that was a kind of a very clear sense in the direction of travel. But clearly this year it's even more different than we potentially ever expected it to be. So if I just kind of go back through those weeks in August, really, just for members to be aware of the decisions that were made and the impact that those decisions had. So the first thing to say is that throughout the early summer, I guess in May, June, and May and June, Quals Wales, which is the independent regulator in Wales, undertook a consultation with stakeholders about how it would seek to standardise examination results in Wales this summer. There were concerns raised about that process, but we worked through the process with Quals Wales as the Directors of Education in Wales, and obviously Welsh Government were involved in that. And now the famed kind of algorithms were determined as a process by which the grades could be determined for this summer. As we got closer to A-level day in particular, there was kind of an intensified speculation about the way that algorithm might work and the impact that that would have on our students. And so in Wales, we saw several discussions and decisions made in a number of days that impacted on the way that children received their examination results. So the first one, and this is for Key Stage 5, so this is children kind of broadly of age 18 finishing school and likely to be looking to progress to either work-based learning or higher education. The first decision that was made was that in Wales, any student would be able to access their AS level grade if it was better than the algorithm determined A2 level grade. So in Wales, we still have a coupled examination system after the end of statutory education. At the end of the first year, children sit their AS level. That makes up 40% of their overall A level. And in the second year, they sit their A2, which is the remaining 60% of the qualification. So on the 12th of August, the Minister made the announcement that the AS grade would be eligible to be counted if it was better than the A2 level grade determined by the system. So on that Thursday, the 13th, examination results were published. Our schools supported their students, as they always do, and worked really hard to make sense of the announcement that had been made the previous day and to understand what impact that would have on children's ability to access their desired next steps. And when I say that, I guess realistically, for the majority of students, that actually means where they want to go on to study further in education. That's really, ever since I've been undertaking this job of chief officer, has always been the kind of key consideration for us when we talk about the end of Key Stage 5, because it's really about what does that Key Stage 5 enable you to access, and the students will be aware of the grades that they need to access whichever institution of higher education they want to, and they'll be working very hard to achieve those grades. And all our schools were already set up to support those learners to actually access those institutions. However, you may well be aware then over the weekend, the following weekend, there was a huge outcry, particularly right across the UK, about the impact of the algorithm, about its unfairness, and about how seemingly children who tended to be in larger schools in disadvantaged areas or colleges in disadvantaged areas seem to be penalised by the algorithm to a greater extent than those who were in smaller schools. Some of that is relevant to Wales, but not all of it is, because in Wales, the argument put forward by the government and by the examination board and by Quals Wales was always that for A2, we had a much better indicator of existing attainment because we already had the AS grade. However, following discussions across the UK, the Welsh Government took the decision early in the following week to move to a position whereby centre assessed grades, which were the grades that were submitted by schools to examination bodies that represented what they believed a student would reasonably achieve in the summer, could be used as well as the previous year's AS grade, as well as the algorithm grade. So we moved from Wednesday having 2 potential outcomes to, I think, by the Tuesday of the following week, which would be the 18th, having potentially 3 outcomes in play for those students who have just finished their Key Stage 5. So in essence, they had the opportunity or their best grade would be determined as being either their AS grade, the grade determined by the algorithm, or their centre assessed grade, or CAG as they're referred to. So those students have been through a period of significant volatility, and we know from talking to our schools that that did impact on some of our students. We know that from talking to our schools that for some of our students, accessing their desired HE course was more challenging than we would have hoped it would have been. And those are the types of issue that we're working to resolve. So Key Stage 5 is, I would say, ordinarily the more straightforward of the 2 examination results. However, this year it was probably more problematic because of the confusion in regards to which grades were taken up, but not only that, because obviously then universities had responded to children who achieved certain grades on the 13th and then had to look at how they managed their offers into children and students right across the UK. So a very, very challenging period of time for our schools. We were in very close contact with all 4 of our secondary heads to understand what they were doing to support our learners to make sure that they could access the relevant HE courses that they wanted to. And I think when we come back to these matters at a subsequent meeting of this committee, we'll be able to provide with you destination data from our schools, because I think for this year, that will be a more telling set of data that we can analyse and understand, rather than thinking about the number of children who achieve certain thresholds. I'll pause there just a second, Chair, just to see if anyone has any questions on the Key Stage 5 outcomes.
Yes. Well, thanks, Will, for that first part of your report. Are there any questions or issues that members wish to raise at this stage about the A-level results in Wales? Councillor Louise Brown.
Yeah, thank you. I was just wondering, obviously, because there's sort of 3 different types of grades over this week, did students lose out on any places with the period of approximately, sounds like about a week, in terms of the determination? And when they apply to the higher education universities and so forth, do they have to actually state what their assessment is based on? Because obviously for each subject there could be 3, there could be the AS assessment, the CAD assessment and the algorithm assessment. And you know, obviously they have the choice of the best of 3, but do they have to identify which one they're using? Or you know, because it makes it extremely complicated for you know, universities in terms of how they assess who can and can't meet the grade to do a particular course. I mean, it sounds quite traumatic in many senses for the pupils going through this system, you know. I mean, I suppose it could be a relief to some, but then if they've missed out on a place. Okay, thanks.
Okay, go back to Will McLean then, please.
Excellent, thank you, and thank you for the questions, Councillor Brown. In terms of, I don't at the moment have a specific number of children in Monmouthshire who we believe missed out on their first choice. So we will try and kind of ascertain that during that kind of destination analysis to understand if there were those cases. I think ordinarily on any A-level results day, there will be some children who don't get the grades they need to go to their first choice university. And through the UCAS admissions process, children and students identify normally a second institution that they will go to if that's the case, and they'll have worked through the same process of understanding if that is the type of institution they want to go to, the right course and so on. We were aware that this year we had some children access clearing. That's the process by which all of the university places which are still available and haven't been filled as first or second choice offers are made available to the general student population. You can enter clearing for courses if your grades are both better or worse than you were expecting. So we know that some children had to use clearing to access courses, and that might suggest that they didn't access their first choice. In terms of my understanding of the grade situation, I don't believe that there was any necessity or requirement to disclose which grades you had used. I think simply the examination boards managed that process, and it actually took a little while for that to be worked through, but the examination board released the grades themselves, determining which was the grade which should be allocated to that child. So if I use the word choice, it wasn't a choice that a student had to make, but there were 3 different variables which could determine a grade that the student would achieve, and then the highest one was taken.
Any other questions from members at the moment? No. Okay.
I think Councillor Grocott has put his hand, wants to know how to put his hand up.
Right.
It's in the meeting chat.
Yeah, Councillor Grocott, do you want to come in at this point?
No, not at this point. It's just that I don't seem to have a hand to raise either in the chat column or on the bar on screen. So it was really, I might well want to speak at some point in the meeting, but nowhere do I seem to have a hand to raise. I am muted, which is quite unusual for me.
Well, yes, I couldn't find.
You're muted, Tudor.
I think if we don't seem to have that facility, so just put it in the chat bar and I'll keep an eye on the chat bar. Now to Will McLean.
Okay, thank you again, Chair. So now we'll come to the end of statutory education, which is Key Stage 4, and I'll just talk a little bit around where we are with regards to Key Stage 4 and how we are going to progress with this this year. Members will hopefully recall the sessions that we've had as CYP Select with the EAS colleagues with us, and will recall that there are some key indicators that we normally look to collect and understand progress towards, both as a schooling system, but also looking and discussing with individual schools. So if I just step back into the summer period, and obviously that announcement that the Minister's made in that week beginning the 17th of August, clearly marked out the fact that for GCSEs, students would be awarded the highest of either their centre assessed grade, so that was the grade determined by the school as a reasonable expectation of what that student would achieve that year, and the grade that was determined by the algorithm. So I guess the first thing to say about that is that there's no, within that system now, there's no kind of control in terms of the outcomes that students are going to receive, in terms of the external parameter that the algorithm would have provided is no longer there, because the algorithm will now only provide inflationary pressure to outcomes. And so this will be most significantly determined by centre assessed grades, which are those undertaken by the teachers in a school. So we've been very clear with all of our schools that because of the vagaries of the system and processes this year, and I think this goes for all of the key stakeholders, we won't be able to use GCSE outcomes in the same way that we might have done in the past for accountability purposes. And as I said at the outset, we're trying to move away from a kind of a very public and kind of published approach to a much more nuanced approach to understanding the performance year on year and so on. But the changes that have been taking place in the summer are so significant that it makes it very, very difficult for us to do anything on a school basis, and we'll be working closely with our schools in the coming weeks to understand what happened in the summer in their schools beyond the headline data, but also to really work with them closely to make sure that their preparations for next year are in place. And I think just to give you a sense of the the scale of the change, in terms of the national figures, so this is all students at all schools in Wales, so this is information that's readily available and was published by Quals Wales and on the day. For the A star grade, this is probably just as an illustrative point really, for the A star grade in 2019, 7% of students accessed the A star grade. In 2020, it was 12.1%. So there was a percentage points difference of 5.1% between 2019 and 2020. For A star A, which would be our very highest performing students accessing those top two grades, that moved from 18.4% in 2019 up to 25.9% in 2020, an increase of 7.5%. A star to C, and C was the old line of kind of pass or fail, a good pass, I think. That moved from 62.8% in 2019 to 74.5% in 2020, a difference of 11.7%. Whereas the full pass rate, which is A star to G, had a much more a much smaller increase of 97.2% in 2019 to 99.6% in 2020, an increase of just 2.4%. So you'll see there that the whole system shifted significantly in 2020. And that means that we have to be very careful in the way that we use that data. We have to be really clear with our schools in the way that they've used the data, and just, I think, just take a very measured approach this year to work with our schools. The one thing which I'm really pleased about is that the process that we went through during the year with our schools, through the meetings that we hold with all 4 schools, gave us a good indication of where the schools were tracking to at the end of this year. And largely, our schools, there are 1 or 2 exceptions with certain indicators, but largely schools have been in line with the trajectories that they indicated they were likely to be on throughout the year. So I think that's important. There are going to be some opportunities for additional analysis, and we will, you have my commitment in the interest of openness to bring all of the analysis which we are able to do back to this committee at a later date. I think one of the things which we've been very clear about as directors within Gwent and the EAS region is that we want to do this on a very like-minded approach. So we want to find a common approach to sharing that data and a common approach to the analysis that we have, because we feel that that's really important for all of the schools in the region, that we do that as we go forwards. So when we do bring that information back to you, I think we'll be looking to understand some of the dynamics around the CAP9. So the CAP9, as I hope members recall, is now the kind of the principal measure at the end of Key Stage 4. It's made up of 9 kind of qualification slots. 3 are set and determined. They are the literacy measure, which is the best of either Welsh or English literature or language. The numeracy measure, which is the best of mathematics or numeracy mathematics for any student, and then the science measure, which is the best grade from a science GCSE for a learner. So those 3 are set, and then the 6 remaining slots can be filled with the 6 best outcomes that that learner achieves. So we'll look at those, and it'd be interesting to understand the potential differences within this year's cohort, rather than probably comparing this year's cohort to previous cohorts. So the attainment of boys and girls, of our FSM, non-FSM learners, those will be the areas I think that we'll be able to look at with more clarity than really looking back and comparing this year to previous years, because I don't think that would be fair on this year, and I'm not necessarily sure it would be fair on previous years either. There are other areas of interest that we'll be looking at with our schools, and that's subject performance and so on. And as all of that information that we can develop, we will bring back to this committee at a future date. I talked about destinations when I talked about Key Stage 5, but destinations are also really important at the end of Key Stage 4, because many students will be making decisions about what they study at A level. Many students will be making decisions about which institution they stay at or which institutions they change to go to, be that an FE college or an apprenticeship. And so actually this year, making sure that students are really well counselled and briefed in terms of the impact of their choices, the impact of their grades, became absolutely critical for our schools, because the step, all transitions in education are challenging. You know, we've talked at length previously about the transition between Key Stage 2 and 3, the end of primary school into secondary, but the step between GCSE and A level is a considerable step. You know, the A level is an advanced level of study. And the one piece is, and you know, as I went through those, you can see that there's been an uplift in the number of children accessing the higher grades. And all of the schools have been very clear that they've worked through with their pupils in a really well-informed and considered way. What's the best opportunity? What are the best options for students to learn? They've known their students for 5 years as opposed to a single exam outcome, and they'll really understand what courses are best suited to those learners. Nevertheless, I think we are seeing increased numbers of children staying on at our sixth forms, and I think that's something to be really positive and proud about in terms of how we go forward, because we want a thriving post-16 environment within Monmouthshire. I'll pause there again, if that's okay. I know it's an update which is not similar to previous years when there would have been data and so on that I would have been able to share. Hopefully there will be some of that in the future. But as I said, we'll be guided by the approach that Welsh Government and the region and with colleague directors determine that we should take, which is fair as to our schools. So I'll pause for questions, but perhaps I don't know if maybe Sharon has anything that she wants to add to my comments.
Sharon, do you wish to come in?
No, I think Will's been given a pretty comprehensive summary of where we are at this point in time, other than to just, confirm as well. We are looking at a range of data to be able to bring back if we've had chance to analyse it.
OK, thanks. Councillor Louise Brown wishes to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. What I was wondering about is how you're going to prepare, or how Wales is going to prepare to deal with the question of next year's results, because there could be local lockdowns in certain areas, and also if you're going to go by the previous year's results, they're obviously better than the years before. And I just wondered whether, I think on a national basis, it would actually be useful to see if various courses have actually also inflated the grades that they require to access a course. Because normally they get sort of like an offer of a certain level of grades according to the system. But when they're going to go through clearing or whatever, these courses have only got a certain number of places or, available. So that if the grades on the whole are higher, are they actually, does it actually work out as no different in terms of accessing the courses? And that's really sort of a national clearinghouse assessment, really, because I think that would be useful to know, because in fact it might result in, although they've got better grades, it might result in their chances of getting on a course being actually quite similar. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Go back to Will then, please.
OK, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Brown again. In terms of preparation for next year, we met as the 22 Directors of Education last Friday with Welsh Government officials, and clearly that was one of the first questions that was asked. I think the important announcement recently has been the independent review into what happened this summer. That's going to be undertaken by the Director of the Open University in Wales, whose name escapes me at the moment. But that, I believe there's going to be an interim report to the Minister in October with a final report by December. I think the message from Welsh Government was that there won't be a rushed decision as to how they deal with next summer's examinations. I think they're going to take that time to make sure that they make the right decision about next summer. That you potentially, members will have heard in the press some of the ideas around kind of moving examinations back by a period of time to allow children to have more time to make up for the learning that they potentially lost during the lockdown period. My understanding is that that probably isn't quite as easy as perhaps it might sound, and that there are additional complications to that. But that's the kind of suggestion that's being used at the moment. Other suggestions are using centre assessed grades again, but this time having an increased level of moderation, either from examining bodies or from school-based moderation, and schools moderating each other, because obviously this year, because of the way the process worked through, there was no moderation between schools. So schools submitted as individual examination centres to the examination board their centre assessed grades. Now, always, the teachers will have done that in the very best faith, using all of the evidence that they had available to them. They'll have been signed off by head teachers before they're submitted and so on. But I guess the opportunity might be there for a greater degree of moderation to be introduced into that system. But as I said, the Welsh Government and Quals Wales will be the bodies who are responsible for determining that approach, and I expect that we'll see details of that emerge as we go further into the autumn term. And yes, I guess your point around those children looking to access higher education, I guess the risk would be if it was thought at the outset that the algorithm had benefited some groups more than others, that they would be able to gain access to places. But the way that the CAGs were used, I guess the whole system had that inflationary pressure, and therefore everybody would have benefited from that pressure if that inflationary pressure existed. So I think you're right. So I think it'll be interesting to see what the plans are and how HE as a sector responds to its plans for next year. The submissions for UCAS applications are in this autumn term, so students will now be thinking about where they want to apply. For the vast majority, I don't think for medicine and veterinary studies, I think that might have had to be done already, but for the majority of courses, those will be being worked through now. Children will be including within those submissions things like predicted grades and so on. So all of that will now be in play for those sectors in terms of how they determine how they manage their admissions next year.
Just wondering, Chair, if I could just come back.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any suggestion in this review, or could it be suggested in the review, whether there was any increase in the grades required because of the fact that the grades on a whole were higher, and so it would actually work out in a sense, you know, so that the pupils would be in effectively the same position. Do you see what I mean in terms of chances?
Yes.
Okay.
So the grades, the offers from universities would all have been made already by those institutions. So one of the changes that's happened certainly since my day, which is increasingly in the far distance, children, our pupils quite often know whether they've been accepted by their institution before they get their examination results on the morning in August, because the universities will have made their offers considerably before that. Universities also receive the examination results before schools, so all of that will have happened. So the universities wouldn't have had the opportunity to change the offer to children this year, but next year they might think about who they offer to, how many places they offer, because they typically, for popular courses, over offer, knowing that in any normal year children won't always achieve the grades that they're predicted or are potentially expecting, because that's the nature of an examination process. So I think that's going to be one that we'll have to wait and see what happens over the year, Councillor Brown.
It's probably more the impact, sorry to come back, it's probably more the impact really, I suppose, on the algorithm. They got a set grade and they were dealt with first and they knew about that. And I suppose it's going to be really, because they had a best choice of 3 for the A levels, then really I suppose it's a question of whether or not through clearing there was a higher grade thing. It would probably affect it more, you know, if you didn't get your grades and then you did get your grades through.
I think we've explored that quite a bit now, haven't we, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to come back on that, Will, at all, or not?
I think I wouldn't be as au fait with the intricacies of the clearing system to answer that in an informed way, I'm afraid.
No. Okay, thanks. Any other members with a question or issue that they wish to raise about Key Stage 4? No? Well, Will, I'd like to very much thank you for giving that update today, verbal update on really what is a very complicated picture, both at Key Stage 5 and Key Stage 4. And obviously there's been so much media interest across the summer. It's been incredibly difficult. I think the main concerns of the committee are obviously to thank teachers as well for their inputs and time, and particularly sixth form, GCSE and A-level teachers for the time they probably spent over the results period, and you know, we are extremely grateful for that. But I think the main concerns are the issue of fairness, particularly going forward for next year's cohort, because their teaching has been disrupted and they've lost probably quite a major element, a chunk of teaching, and who knows what's going to happen now in the forthcoming winter and spring months before the next set of exams. You know, undoubtedly exams are probably the best and fairest way of assessing, because obviously they're standardized and there is an awarding process which takes into account inputs from the stats, but also the key input is the exam, and we clearly haven't had that this year. So it is something that I'm sure we will come back to, and I know you will come back again to us with an update on outcomes, and it is obviously something that as a committee we are incredibly concerned about, and we want to be updated. So thanks for your input today. It has clarified issues quite clearly for us, but we will obviously be asking you to come back at a later date. We're now going to go to agenda item 5, and again it's the Senior Officer Will McLean who's going to give us again a verbal update on the return to school, which is only obviously just a week or so away. So we'll go back to you now, Will, about the return to school in this last September. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity. I think this is really timely for me to be able to brief the committee about where we are in Monmouthshire with our return to school. It would be timely anyway, because we're just starting week 2 of the term. However, given the announcements that I'm sure many councillors will have seen in the last 24 hours, 48 hours about schools across South Wales, it's even more timely. And clearly the context we're talking in is a return to school which is in completely unprecedented circumstances compared to where we've been in the past. At the end of last term, I gave a briefing to this committee about the return to school at that time, and at that point we were returning for 3 weeks at the end of the summer term, and there were very clear parameters around that return to school, and they were that in essence those were staying in touch contact sessions for children, and that no more than 30% of a school's capacity could be in school at any one time. And we had a very successful return to school in those 3 weeks. And I think the coverage that certainly I saw, the feedback from head teachers, was that the children were very glad to be back in school. We had one of the highest participation rates across Wales in terms of attendance. I think both staff and children were very glad to be back. And I think to see children, to make sure they were able to kind of do that kind of the well-being checks, but also to give each other reassurance about how those systems and processes in a school work to make sure that everybody's safe for the upcoming return. So I think the first thing I want to say is that over the summer, the head teacher community, their senior leadership teams, colleagues within the authority in catering, cleaning, passenger transport have put a huge amount of work in to make sure that we could fulfil the guidance provided by Welsh Government around the operational return to school this autumn. We have met, I think, for the last 3 weeks of the school holiday, we met as CYP staff and head teachers on a Friday to work through questions and queries to understand the best ways of doing certain things. I think that was really important. Not only did we meet head teachers, we've also met the trade unions every Friday, so representatives from all of the main leadership and teaching bodies and support staff unions to make sure that they are comfortable with the direction of travel and the approaches that we're taking. But we've also seen significant changes to the guidance as the summer has progressed as well. So we're now on version 3 of the guidance around the return to school, and that's the version that we're now advising our schools on to make sure that they are as prepared for the return to school. I think the first thing to say is that the guidance sets out quite clearly that Welsh Minister gave schools 2 weeks to build up to full school occupation. So we had discussed that locally, and we had determined that we felt that it was appropriate that schools had 2 days without children in to prepare for their sites and to prepare their systems and processes. That approach was one that was mirrored across both the region and the nation, and eventually Welsh Government determined that that all schools would have 2 days for planning and preparation, and that they would be in addition to the 6 inset days that needed to be taken for staff development this year. So there was a clear differentiation between those days around kind of post-COVID return and more the broader professional learning to prepare for things like the new curriculum and so on. On Tuesday the 1st and Wednesday the 2nd, all of the schools in Monmouthshire took those days to prepare their school settings and to work with the teachers to make sure the systems were understood. And then on a differing basis, depending on the local circumstances of those schools, schools have begun that return to full occupation by Monday the 14th. Now, I'm pleased to say that for the vast majority of our primary schools, they will be at full capacity before the 14th. Many will be at full capacity in the coming days, most likely by tomorrow or Thursday. And our secondaries, 3 of the secondaries are working their way through a kind of a rolling admittance programme. So most started last week with the years of transition, so years 7 and 12, so those children new to school or new to sixth form, and then are admitting, you know, probably year 13 and year 10, and then maybe years 8 and 9 after that, until they get to full occupancy. One of our schools is taking a slightly different approach in that they are having, they had 7 and 12 in last week. This week they're having 11 and 13, the 2 key examination groups, to really work with them in school in terms of catch-up work ready for examination series, whilst the rest of the school will be receiving a blended learning offer. And so they'll be doing work, but they'll just be doing work at home in a slightly different way. But next week, all of the schools will have all of their pupils back. Schools have worked really hard, and I'm grateful to colleagues within the CYP department and directorate for all the work they've done to support schools, to work through their risk assessments, to go and walk sites, to consider how spaces work. That's been really, really important, and I think is a key indicator of the commitment to safety of both staff and pupils as we return to school. We've also had to work very carefully with our HR colleagues to make sure that those members of staff who had been shielded can come back to school safely, if it is safe to do so. So that's been another part of our key considerations. The guidance is very clear about the measures that should be taken, and those measures really kind of are all premised around prevention being the most important aspect. And as you would expect, prevention, people who are either symptomatic with COVID-like symptoms shouldn't be in school. People who have household members shouldn't be in school. Those are kind of key kind of bottom lines. But then we move through the more kind of frequently discussed aspects of protection and prevention. So cleaning hands more thoroughly and more frequently than normal, good respiratory hygiene, catch it, bin it, kill it, increased cleaning in frequently used areas, and then for schools, a key area which was to minimise contact between individuals and maintain social distancing wherever possible. So just for clarity for members on this, the Welsh Government guidance made it clear that social distancing did not have to exist between children, but it did have to exist between contact groups. So typically, within a school, a primary school, a contact group would be a class. So the majority of our primary schools are 210 schools. So for each year group, there is a single class. So 7 groups of 30 gives you the 210. So for those, their contact group is their class. So those children, we took steps to make sure that there's staggered starts to the school day, that they're based in a classroom, so they don't have communal time together in school halls or anything, no assemblies. They go to their classroom, they're provided their lunch in their classroom, they have staggered lunch breaks so they can play by themselves or distinct areas of the schoolyard or school grounds. And that's been an absolutely fundamental approach. It's much easier to do that contact group management at primary school than it is at secondary school, because for the curriculum to work in a secondary school, you need many more teachers teaching a broader range of subjects. So the way that our secondary schools have managed that is that year groups have become the contact groups. So children are able to mix freely within their contact group within their year, but they aren't able to mix within different years. So if I'm a year 7 pupil in Monmouth CompSA, then the controls are in place that I mix with my friends in year 7, but I can't then go and mix with a friend who might be in year 9. So that's the control, and the integrity of those contact groups is really important. The other point just to mention on that is that teachers and adults in school should maintain the 2 meter social distancing that has been advised since the outbreak of this pandemic, right from the beginning. So that's really important. There have been some additional bits of guidance around how children should be managed within the classroom. So things like children in rows facing the front rather than facing each other. Those little type of classroom management issues have been put into place because that minimises the risk of kind of face-to-face transmission. We've also obviously talked around things like protective equipment and where that's needed, and the important role that the test, trace, protect strategy plays in maintaining confidence in our school settings. The one area of school life which has been kind of more challenging to manage than potentially otherwise has been home to school transport. I'm hugely grateful to colleagues Devil Howells and Naomi Thomas and Gareth in PTU who've managed the allocation of routes so well this year. And we've moved to a position as of the guidance being published the week before last about the use of face coverings, that on our school transport, any child over the age of 11 must wear a face covering to minimise the risk of transmission on school transport. So that's critical. So those are the kind of some of the key kind of principles that the schools have been working with to make sure that it's safe for them to return to school. There's been lots of detail, as you would imagine, about how certain schools deal with their estate, and that's why we've taken the approach, which is that we will act as guides. I have signed off all of the risk assessments, but we can't set county-wide kind of approaches because so many of our schools are different in the nature of their estate. If you think about, I'm trying to think of a couple of examples, a school like Raglan, for instance, where the children are taught in plazas, big open plan areas. A school like Cantrev in Abergavenny, which is a much older school, although it's been refurbished, it's still very kind of traditional classrooms. So there are different types of schools which will have different risk assessments. So we've sought to support and advise and guide our schools rather than unilaterally imposing approaches. And the face coverings is a good example of that. So the announcement was made in the week before the children returned to school by Vaughan Gethin and Kirsty Williams as Ministers for Health and Education respectively, that they would recommend that where social distancing cannot be maintained, that face coverings are used in those communal areas. We have 2 schools, so we have 4 schools in Monmouthshire, 2 of which are relatively new builds now, in Caldecott and Monmouth, and 2 of which are older builds. But each of the 4 schools has taken a risk-based approach to how they want to use face coverings. And as we are here at 11 o'clock, nearly on the 8th, We have 2 schools where children do wear face coverings and 2 schools where children don't. And I think that doing that on a risk-based approach, looking at the systems and processes that they have in situ, talking to stakeholders, understanding how the dynamic of the school works on a day-by-day basis is the critical way to do that. So King Henry, for instance, took a very early decision because they knew that their corridors weren't as wide as other schools, so they felt that they wouldn't be able to maintain social distancing in those environs, so they've gone to face coverings. Whereas, for instance, Chepstow feel confident in their risk assessment at the moment. I'm in regular discussion with all of the heads, and I understand the positions they're all in. And across the Gwent region, there is a pattern that reflects exactly what we're seeing in Monmouthshire. So, for instance, in Blaenau Gwent, I don't think Lynn will mind me saying, none of the schools in Blaenau Gwent at the moment are wearing face masks in communal areas, about 50% in Newport. So it's a mixed picture right across the region. The one exception to that is Caerphilly, which is probably a little bit more exceptional today than it was yesterday. But the schools in Caerphilly have chosen that they will wear their face masks in the classroom as well. That's not in line with the guidance that we've seen from Welsh Government, but is a decision that they've taken locally. And what we will continue to do is to work with all of our schools. And I think we had a really good discussion at ADU last week with Steve Davis, the Director for Education in Wales, and we'll kind of mirror their approach, which is that everything should be around caution and upholding those very fundamental approaches to the mitigation around proportionality, to make sure that the measures you take are proportional to the risk at any point in time and do give you the room to escalate if you need to, and that we make those decisions at the right point. So subsidiarity is also really, really important. I'll pause there because there might be some questions on the return immediately, and then perhaps, Chair, I might just offer a view to the committee on some of the events that are taking place across South Wales at the moment. And I'd also just potentially just like to ask Sharon if she could just give members some of the sense around what the EAS are doing with our schools to prepare them for the potential return for blended learning in a broader setting in the future.
OK, thanks. I know that Councillor Martin Grogan has a question, so I'll bring in Councillor Martin Grogan with a question on the return to school issue.
Thank you, and thanks for that comprehensive update there. Well, really very helpful. One important group, certainly at the primary school with which I'm associated as a governor, that you didn't refer to, is parents, and parents milling around the entrances to schools. We have tried really very hard to make sure that doesn't happen, but jungle telegraphs are powerful weapons, and parents around doors have been a feature of many of our primary schools. Yeah. Is there any sort of picture on how that's going across the county?
I think that's a really excellent question. And I think it's one of those areas which I think we are going to have to reinforce, and potentially I've got a meeting this afternoon with our head teachers that we've brought forward from Friday just to discuss kind of the early returns and some of those issues, and I'm sure that will be raised there. I've had another school, another 2 schools actually raise potential road closures so that they can manage the parents queuing to pick up and so on more effectively. So I think that will be a key consideration for us. And I think one of the things we're seeing in terms of the change in the dynamic of the way the virus is developing at the moment is that as we enter, I guess, in the latter phases of the lockdown, we saw those 1 or 2 instances in Wales where they were very focused on particular institutions. There was a couple of kind of meat packing, meat processing kind of factories. I think what we're seeing this time is kind of age groups being effective and affected, and clearly we need to make sure that everybody continues to understand the importance of social distancing and know where is that more important than places like picking your children up from school and so on. So I'm sure that will come up this afternoon, Martin, and if we need to do something around that, then we will message that on a county-wide basis.
Thanks. Could I just follow that up slightly, Chair?
Yeah, carry on, Councillor Grocott.
I think we might well have a golden opportunity here once parents are hopefully weaned off the idea they have to take their little darlings right to the school door every day of the week, to actually wean parents off the school run. And I know in other committees and other places we have talked about the safety aspects of increased traffic around schools at the start and end of the day and so on. And I'm just hoping that if parents get out of the habit now of thinking they have to drive their children to school every day, that we could have a campaign to actually take that forward into the future as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Councillor Grocott. And I know that we're out for consultation on our active travel measures at the moment, and schools are an absolutely fundamental part of that. And having spoken to several head teachers, I know they're really trying to kind of engage their children in actually, you know, how can you come to school safely without a car? And that's a key kind of consideration for us, and about the broader ambitions of the kind of climate reduction and adaptation agenda as well.
Okay, thanks for that, Councillor Grocott, and thanks for the response, Will. Go to a question now, Councillor Louise Brown.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask a couple of questions, if that's all right. One of the questions was, we were talking about, you know, collection of children, and also, you know, the issue of transport and so forth. One of the images you know, is difficult to forget is when all of those people came off that aeroplane, and they were all kitted up with various kits, and then the bus driver didn't have a mask on. And you know, I just wondered what the situation was with bus drivers in relation to primary school children and secondary school children, whether they were actually wearing masks as well. And also the question is in terms of masks, do they have a different mask for the school bus as opposed to masks for communal areas? And if they haven't got masks, do the schools provide them? And moving on from the question of masks, I personally think it's a bad idea that in England they have to wear masks in shops, but they don't have to wear them in Wales. But the other issue is we've looked at the lockdown in, presumably the lockdown now is happening in Caerphilly. How does this relate to the guidance in terms of what effect it has? You know, for example, you've mentioned about year groups. Is it the whole of a year group that gets isolated and, you know, has to do the 14 days? Or, you know, how would it actually work? And the second main area, I've talked about obviously masks mainly, but the second area is to do with the extra teachers that were promised by Kirsty Williams in terms of helping pupils catch up, and how have we been allocated those teachers, and where have they gone, and have we had a fair distribution? So it's really, one's to do with masks and transport and communal areas, and the other is basically to do with lockdown, and then the other question is to do with extra teaching and how this is going to, I mean, I think it was extra teaching assistants and various other people that could help out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown. Go back to Will McLean now.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so yes, bus drivers have to wear a mask unless they've got a medical condition, which means they can't wear a mask. That's the same for children on the bus as well. So unless someone cannot wear one, then they are expected to. I know that all of our own PTU drivers have been, you know, very clearly given that instruction, as have the companies that we contract to. In terms of the same, and I think this is where sometimes the language is really important. So I think if you talk about masks, then we move into, you know, what's a compliant face covering or a mask and so on. Children could use the same face covering on the school transport as they use in school, and many of us will have seen, you know, you're now able to buy reusable, washable face coverings. You know, World Health Organization shown different approaches, how you can make them with an old t-shirt or even a pair of socks and those kind of things. So yes, could wear the same one on both in both settings, that would be fine. With regards to provision of masks, we have for all of our schools, we have made a small supply available to them already, so that if children need them, then they can be provided with them if they don't have one. But yesterday, or yes, I think it was yesterday, Welsh Government announced funding that will allow all local authorities to supply all secondary schools with a supply of face coverings, so that they can do that safely. So yes, so I think that's all the mask questions. The question arising from the Caerphilly incident, and there are a couple of other incidences now across Wales. I think there's one in Bridgend and one in Cardiff as well. It all depends on how the contact is made, and the advice around self-isolation comes from the test and trace advisors, not from our interpretation of guidance. So we understand at the point at which we need to communicate to our colleagues around test and trace, and that's also around the fact that that they are advised of any positive tests by the testing regime as well. So the case, I think, in Caerphilly that I think you referred to, that was a teacher who tested positive, I think, from recollection, and their contact with the class had been determined as being a close contact. So that class was asked to self-isolate for 14 days. At that point, those individuals have to self-isolate, but family members don't. But if one of those children who's been asked to self-isolate becomes symptomatic, then they should have a test and their family members should have a test at that point. So we're always guided and advised by the test and trace colleagues with regards to how that's done. With regard to the extra teachers for support, yes, you're absolutely right. Welsh Government allocated £28 million to its Accelerated Learning Programme, or ALP. Monmouthshire's share of that, I think, over the full year is about £517,000. We distributed that to school. We've sent schools their allocation this week with the terms and conditions. That is to recruit teachers for this academic year. So they will be recruited for this year to help interventions in schools. There's a range of different approaches to doing that. And I know, speaking to head teachers, they're working through what they think are the best approaches to make sure that those children get that accelerated learning where that's necessary for them. So yeah, so that's where we are on the ALPS grant. So yes, we've received that, and we're now in the process of the schools determining how they seek to use it.
Thank you. Could I just ask another question? Sorry. Yeah, was it based, thank you for your answers on the other questions. Was it, the 517k, how we get allocated things on a revenue support grant basis? How did they determine the level of funding? Was it, on the basis of the number of pupils or something like that? Or how did they actually assess what you were paid? And how many teachers does that sort of sum represent on a sort of a yearly basis? Because I'm not really quite sure. Thank you.
Yeah, so the allocation, when we had it from Welsh Government, was predicated on two factors: your total pupil numbers, and then three kind of subsidiary factors, I guess, which were percentage of population, which is, or student numbers who are eligible for free school meals, student numbers who are from a BAME background, black and ethnic minority background, and also the number of learners who are in Welsh medium education but who are from an English medium home, because clearly the lack of ability to be in school has been identified as a key risk for those learners. So Welsh Government determined funding on a 50-50 split between those two factors. In discussion with head teachers and in terms of our aspirations and commitment to our FSM and closing the gap, we slightly adjusted that so that it was a 60-40 split. So 60% of the funding was allocated on the number of pupils who were FSM, BAME or Welsh as a second language, but in a Welsh medium school, and 40% on the total school numbers. And we discussed that with the head teachers. But one thing that we did do in response to head teachers' requests was that we used the most up-to-date FSM numbers we had, not PLASC, and we obtained those from our benefit service, because obviously we've been paying directly FSM payments since the pandemic and the lockdown began. So that's how we administered that grant.
Okay, well, thanks, Will, for that response. Are there any other questions from members about return to school? No. Can I just ask, and perhaps you've partially answered, but one of the concerns I have is about children coming from more challenging backgrounds, and obviously children on free school meals having slipped back, as it were, further, and that seems to be the evidence coming nationally from the UK, as opposed to children who are in more sort of supportive homes and where parents perhaps can help them. They've got sufficient IT and the ability to help. Will there be any special programme for those children, or will it be picked up under the additional teachers and learning support people?
Well, I think they're always a focus. Those learners for us, and in all of our conversations with our school, they're always a key focus for us. Clearly, the ALP programme will help support them and supports children right across the ages in school. But I don't know, Sharon might have some additional information about the work that we're expecting to see done with schools in the autumn term. So I'll pause a second and let Sharon come in.
Okay.
Thanks, Will. So in addition to the ALP that schools will be able to access, they also have their own grant, the Pupil Development Grant, which they are targeting towards the needs of our vulnerable pupils. That will include our free school meals pupils, but it is across the board. Those plans are currently being developed and worked through with their challenge advisors, and will come to the local authority. But they do, obviously our schools are as aware as we are that there is a gap in that attainment, and this group is the most vulnerable and needs a lot of support. So their work is being geared towards that, as is their grant. In many cases, when schools have been looking at who will come back and when, it is with an eye on those vulnerable groups to see who will need the longer time back in school to become used to being in school again before everyone joins on the 14th. So in all of their plans, head teachers have considered that group, and going forward, the additional funding will really help to support closing that gap, and we will work with them, as will the EAS, to make sure that they make the best and most effective use to support these groups of pupils going forward.
Okay, well, thanks both. I'm sort of somewhat reassured about that, and particularly the fact of youngsters who are in more challenging backgrounds, that they will have some priority. I know all children are a priority in this COVID situation, but that they will have some priority in terms of going back to school and really having that support of actually being in school, rather than being at home. I know Councillor Jo Watkins has had to leave now, but one issue that she raised as well was the issue about sort of not being able to provide breakfast clubs in the morning so that people can drop their children off for parents go to work, and also the fact that obviously because of COVID at the moment there is no provision of sort of a hot meal at lunchtime, and again for children on free school meals and other probably children in difficult circumstances, that is quite a key issue, and we're in the sort of early autumn now, but as it gets colder, etc., for lots of those children probably that meal is, provision of a hot meal lunchtime is important, but I know you've got to balance it with COVID, so I just wondered any thoughts on that.
Okay, so So Breakfast Club, I'll just offer a comment on Breakfast Club first. First thing to say is we know how important breakfast clubs are to parents in terms of managing, the school day and work day and all of those kind of things. We're working closely with our schools to ensure that they are back up and running from the 14th of September. That has been our kind of discussions with them. Clearly, I think what's happened in the last couple of days in terms of management of contact groups will mean that there are further questions around breakfast clubs. But it's certainly when I meet with head teachers at 3:30 today, that will be a kind of key area for us to discuss and to talk about how the breakfast club situation will be managed. So that's that on that point. So we are hopeful that that will be kind of back in that part of our plans. So FSM, we are at the moment, until the end of this week, we are continuing to pay families for those entitled to preschool meals. Because of the broken nature of the return to school and it not being kind of everybody in at once, we want to run the risk of those children not being able to access food on those days when they're not in school. So everybody is being paid this 2 weeks, and we're being supported by the Welsh Government with regards to that. At the moment, the offer is from catering, which is our catering colleagues have worked unbelievably closely with our schools to make sure that they find the fit that works best. And in the vast majority, that is a kind of grab and go sandwich bag. And there's a couple of choices on a daily basis. But my understanding is that twice a week there's a hot baguette offer, which the children can have if they want that. But I know that talking to Pauline, she is keen, and we are certainly keen that, as we look into probably, the short, medium term, I guess half term, that we're beginning to think about how can hot meals, because absolutely right, as we get into that colder period of the year, those children eligible for free school meals need to be kind of supported then. So we're certainly looking to do that. So as and when that becomes an operational need, we'll look to introduce that back into the school settings.
Okay, well, again, thanks for that. And I can fully appreciate the difficulties of trying to balance the provision of hot meals, but also with the issue of COVID. Councillor Louise Brown, did you want to come in?
Yeah, sorry, I'm jumping in before Councillor Powell. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I can see Maureen. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead then. We'll go to Maureen Powell first. Councillor Powell.
I'm just trying.
Yeah, okay. We can hear you.
That's it. The only problem with giving the money to the families is it being used for the correct use? Is it being used to provide hot meals for the children at home, or is it not being used? We can't govern that money, how it's used, obviously, because we can't go into the houses. So as soon as it is possible to safely provide hot meal for these children, I think it is important, because we don't know whether they are getting a hot meal at home just because we provided the money.
Will, have you any comment? It's a difficult area.
It is, and we took the decision early in the process. There were other methodologies of supporting families, but given some of the problems around voucher schemes and so on, we felt that actually the distribution that we chose to do, which was payments directly to families, was the most effective in Monmouthshire. There hasn't been, I haven't seen or heard any kind of personal kind of level. It would be anecdotal, I guess, of those kind of being problematic. But I guess fundamentally, the risk you identify, Councillor Powell, is a risk. But hopefully, as of Monday, we'll be back in a situation whereby, for all of our children, they're in school and we're able to provide that meal in school.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, it has been through summer, so it hasn't mattered so much. It would matter far more if it was in the winter months. But yes, thank you for that anyway.
No, thank you, Councillor Maureen. Very valid question. Go to Councillor Louise Brown, and then please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's really just to follow on. I think that Councillor Watkins, I might be wrong, but I think she also wanted to ask a question about after school clubs, because the idea of the breakfast clubs was obviously in terms of, you know, ensuring children have a proper meal, but also the after school clubs, they're a combined way of which parents can actually go back to work. And so I want to know if there's I would also be interested in knowing if there's been consideration in the discussions not only about breakfast clubs but also these after school clubs, because you know, otherwise people won't be able to return properly to work because they haven't got the childcare available. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Brown. Well,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in essence, I guess after school club and breakfast club both present very similar challenges to schools, because ordinarily, you know, if I take an example, I think I'm right in saying that Steve King, who's the head teacher at the Dell, said I think his breakfast club is probably in excess of 100 children. So suddenly, you know, you have to manage 100 children in a way that if you're to follow the guidance, they have to be in their contact groups. Do you have room in the hall to manage those children in the contact group who are socially distanced? If you then move into 2 different rooms, you need to double your supervision. Are you able to recruit to that post? There's an additional cost to the school, all of those kind of things. And those issues with clubs and the management of the contact group are replicated exactly in the after school club setting. So that's what we just need to work through. So we are, Sue Hall, who works with our early year providers and those partners who provide some of our independent after school clubs, you know, is a key part of our discussions as we go forward. We're really keen to see both of those settings back up and running, but they're not without their challenges, I think would be what I would say. And, you know, if ever we mix groups, it does increase the risk of transmission, and that's a consideration. So that's that point around the contact groups. But not only that, we have to think about, you know, how are we able to clean down effectively between different groups being in those areas. So those are the practical considerations. So it's certainly not we're not doing it because we don't think it's the right thing to do. We absolutely want to do it, but it's just about making sure that our school staff and those staff who work in those clubs and so on are safe as well, and that it's a viable and safe solution for the rest of this term and probably this academic year.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions or issues now before we come to a close on this agenda item? No. First and foremost, obviously, thank you, Will, and Sharon Randall-Smith now for updating us on this return to school, and express our thanks again, really, to staff, predominantly, obviously, head teachers, and TAs and so on within the school, but also I think the broader spectrum of school transport, the drivers, the people who organise the transport, cleaners, you know, the whole staff in the school really have been put under a great deal of pressure, and people providing the school meal service. And I've been sort of reassured by some of the things that you've said. And again, it is something that I think we will return to in future meetings because of who knows what will happen in terms of COVID as we go into the winter. And I certainly think there's a concern amongst this committee about contingency plans. You know, what's going to happen if we go into the winter period and there is a large spike within the authority in terms of maintaining learning for all children from foundation phase right through to upper 6 to year 13. Yeah. And I think that you know that is a major concern. We can appreciate as well that you cannot issue a sort of an edict across the authority because it wouldn't apply in certain schools, as you said, different buildings, different contexts, and we must allow head teachers you know, to manage that. I think the other thing as well is that this issue of provision of breakfast clubs, after school clubs, and the provision of a hot meal. You know, we will probably come back to that again at some point, because I think it's very important, you know, for all children, but particularly for some children were in more challenging circumstances, you know, they might have a sandwich, a sort of grab and go at school, but they might have the same at home, you know, unfortunately. Whereas other children are going back to a sort of a, you know, balanced sort of tea time meal with their parents, but obviously lots of children are not. And I think that's important. And I fully appreciate the difficulties, but can we keep that sort of in mind? But, you know, once again, thanks for the update, and appreciate that you've had a heavy morning with us this morning. But at the end of the day, you know, that is the point of this committee, and I know that every member of this committee is committed to CYP, to children and young people, and we do want to know, and we will be keeping that sort of watching brief. But, you know, thanks for your time this morning, Will, and thanks Sharon Randall-Smith for coming to the meeting. Diolch yn fawr.
So thank you, and we'll see you soon, I'm sure.
Okay, thank you, Will. Thanks. Okay, we now then move to back to the agenda to item 6, and that is to confirm the children and young people minutes of the meeting on the 9th of July. Are people happy with those minutes? No one? Maureen? Yeah, sorry, yes, Maureen, come in.
I said I'm quite happy with them.
Right, okay, thank you.
Happy?
Yeah, I'm taking it now that unless you dissent, that people are happy, so I will confirm those minutes. We now go to the forward work plan, agenda item 7, and I wonder if people have got any burning issues that they want to bring up in the future work plan. Does anybody want to come in on this? Louise, did you want to bring in an issue about ALN?
Sorry,
yeah, can you come in?
Pressing my camera, it doesn't seem
yes,
to.
Yeah.
Yes, if I could, Chair. One of the issues I'd be interested in looking at is basically the previous Estin reports that we had suggested that Monmouthshire needed to look at the more the ALN strategy, and I think it would be useful if we could have a report on that. You know, I appreciate that there's been a lot of work done by the Will and the education department and teachers and everything in coping with what's going on, and we're all grateful for that. And sort of now they're back at school, it would be helpful if we could look at these sort of more strategic policy areas at this time. I'd also be interested in getting a report on the Mountain House School, because there was the pupils who, when the school was closed, had different destinations, but there were 1 or 2 suggestions of you know, alternative ways of teaching these particular pupils, and I'd be interested in hearing about these different alternatives, because I think one of them was called a living alternative in another authority, and I'd be interested to hear what sort of types of available teaching there are for different types of ALN pupils. And I think the other issue is that we do spend a certain amount on ALN, and it would be useful to know whether or not it's cost effective to think about a special school or not, or whether we're better to outsource. And I think it would be useful at this stage to have a look at that as well.
Okay, thanks. So you've got ALN and then a report on Mountain House, which I both of those I think are very good areas, you know, valid areas to look at. Thank you, Councillor Louise Brown.
Thank you.
Councillor Martin Croker, do you indicated you want to bring up something?
Thank you, Chair. Something that I think could almost become a standing item while the officers are concerned are in post. You'll remember that at County Council some time ago now, a motion was passed to set up new posts that in the post-COVID world, where families are having to deal with very deep economic recession, that there should be specific officers looking at the whole picture of supporting families who are really going through a terrible time. Now, of course, many of those families will have children. And so I wonder if those newly imposed officers could report to us specifically on the problems being faced during the coming economic recession within their families, and also what the authority is able to do to try to ameliorate that, because I think this is going to be a huge issue in the year or two ahead of us. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Councillor Grogan. I think that is a very valid and useful agenda item, particularly in these COVID challenging times, and obviously COVID is not going to go away quickly. So I think that's something that we need to consider. Any other issues that anybody would want to think about in terms of the forward work programme? No, one thing that I would want to bring is to balance, because we've had an issue about balance on CYP between sort of educational issues and children and young people generally. And I want to ask or invite Jane Rogers, Head of Child Services, to bring us a report looking particularly at obviously children who are in care and also vulnerable children. So I would want to at some point invite her to give us a report. I'm trying to rebalance the agenda items between specifically educational issues and the broader children and young people issue. So that's something that I want to bring. So just to recap, we've got ALN, we've got a report on Mountain House, and in particularly in terms of destination, where have the youngsters who were at Mountain House, who obviously are no longer there, where have they gone and how are they getting on? The issue that Councillor Grogan raised about the new post looking at the support that can be offered to families who are in difficult circumstances, and that is something that is important. And then lastly, Jane Rogers with Child Services. Are people happy with those items to go forward onto the work planner? Maureen.
Yeah.
Yes, Maureen Powell, sorry.
I can't get unmuted again now.
No, you're right. Yeah, I can hear you. You've muted again. Maureen, I'm afraid the mute has gone on. Yes, we can hear you now. No, it's gone on again. It's... Yes.
We know.
Yes, I can hear you now.
Yeah, it's very sensitive. It is.
I know.
Now, the only other thing, I mean, I don't want to fill it up too much because it can always be taken on further, is looking into what's happening to young people who have left school and are not into work yet, because unemployment's going to be dire now because of how so many businesses closing down. And what help are we able to give to the children that have finished education and desperately finding work? You know, is there anything we can do to help them, particularly those who have been in care during their life and are out on a limb, so to speak?
Okay, well, we'll.
I mean, if it's too full, that can go on to the next time.
Yeah, I think, you know, thanks, Councillor Powell. I think it's a very valid area. I think in reality, with the team system, I think one or two items is probably enough for us to cope with. But, you know, it's much better to have, we've got 5 items now. it's much better to have that rather than a sort of scratching about looking for things. I think they're all very valid areas, and I appreciate that. I'm grateful to members who brought these issues forward. But we've got 5 there. In reality, it's going to be probably 2 items, I would say, per meeting. But that will certainly go on.
Yeah, that's fine. I
think it's a very important area, Councillor Pearl. I'm grateful to you for bringing it forward. Okay, so we've got a number of items there. We'll now move to agenda item 8, and that is to confirm the date and time of the next meeting. Looking at my diary, the next meeting is on October the 13th, Tuesday, October the 13th at 10 AM.
9:30 pre-meeting.
Yes, with a 9:30 pre-meeting.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody for your attendance today and for your contribution. I was going to say have a safe journey home, but really it's more have a safe switch off, really, in terms of Teams. But thank you very much for your attendance today. Thanks for your input. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for sharing.
Cheers, Chair. Bye, everybody.
Okay, thanks then. Bye bye.